The world never plays fair, and someone somewhere figured out that if they told you that often enough, you'd eventually agree to become someone you were never supposed to be. They packaged betrayal as education. They wrapped manipulation in the language of survival. They handed you 8 traits and called it intelligence, and you nodded along because it sounded like protection. It wasn't. Here's what that philosophy actually produces. Not dangerous men, not untouchable strategists, not kings. It produces men who have optimized themselves into corners so calculated and so cold that no one genuine can reach them anymore. Men who built such sophisticated systems of control that they forgot to build a life worth controlling. Men who learned every lesson in the manual and missed the only one that actually matters. Here's what no one tells you about dark intelligence. It has a cost that doesn't show up in the first year or the 5th. It shows up quietly, incrementally, in the slow disappearance of everything real, in the relationships that never deepened, in the conversations that always stayed strategic, in the moments you were so busy calculating the room that you were never actually in it. They told you that calculated opacity creates influence, that mystery commands respect, that the less you reveal, the more power you hold. And here is where the philosophy sounds true, right up until it doesn't. Because the people who matter, the ones worth having in your life, they don't chase mystery, they move toward warmth, they stay for realness. And the man who made himself strategically unknowable didn't become intriguing, he became unreachable, not untouchable, unreachable. Those are not the same thing. They told you to build an adaptive persona, to mirror whoever you're talking to shift your presentation, to become whatever the room needs you to be, and they dressed it up as communication intelligence. But here's the thing they never address. If you spend enough time being whoever the situation requires, you eventually lose fluency in who you actually are. The mask doesn't just cover the face. Worn long enough, it fuses to it. And the man standing in the room adjusting his personality for maximum effect is the loneliest man in every room he enters. They told you detachment is freedom, that the less you need something, the more power you have over it, that fear of loss makes you weak, and transcendence from that fear makes you powerful. And in negotiations, in transactions, in purely tactical exchanges, there is some truth buried in there. But they took a principle that belongs in a boardroom and told you to apply it to your entire life, to your friendships, to your family, to love. And a man who practices detachment from everything he touches doesn't become powerful, he becomes numb. And numbness is not strength. It is the advanced stage of a wound that was never allowed to heal. They told you silence is leverage, that patience is your weapon, that positioning yourself as indispensable and waiting for people to come to you is the highest form of influence. And while you were busy being strategically silent, while you were planting seeds and waiting for dividends, the people around you were having real conversations, building real trust, saying the actual things. And those people, the ones who spoke honestly and showed up fully and said what they meant, they built something your silent leverage never could. They built relationships that didn't require a strategy to maintain. If this is landing somewhere uncomfortable, good. Subscribe. Content that actually names what these philosophies cost, instead of just repackaging them for a new audience, gets buried by algorithms that prefer the version of this story where you win by becoming colder. Your subscription is a vote for the other version. Here's what all 8 of those traits share that nobody in the dark intelligence space will say out loud. Every single one of them is a response to fear. Calculated opacity, fear of being known. Adaptive persona, fear of being rejected for who you actually are. Detachment, fear of loss dressed up as transcendence. Silent leverage, fear of direct confrontation. Psychological echo, fear of genuine connection replaced by the performance of it. Ambiguous morality, fear of accountability. Controlled exposure, fear of being truly seen. Outcome obsession,
Fear that who you are isn't enough, so you better make sure your results are. 8 lessons, 1 wound. And the philosophy never once addresses the wound. It just hands you 8 sophisticated ways to protect it. The outcome obsession trait deserves its own dismantling because it is the most seductive of the 8 and the most quietly destructive. They told you to focus on results, to ask what action leads to the outcome you want, to measure yourself by what you produce rather than what you feel. And in doing so, they built you a life that looks impressive from the outside and feels like a performance from the inside. Because when you reduce every interaction to its utility, when every conversation is evaluated by what it produced, when every relationship is measured by what it contributed to your goals, you stop being a person in your own life and become a manager of it. And you can manage your way to every metric you set and still wake up at 50, wondering why none of it feels like anything.
Here's what the psychological echo trait actually produces at scale, and why it is the most insidious lesson of the 8. They described it as deep understanding, as becoming a mirror, as reflecting back what people need to hear. And they even had the clarity to call it a tool for building stronger relationships. But a mirror is not a person. A mirror has no interiority, no genuine reaction, no real stake in what it reflects. And the man who has spent years perfecting his ability to reflect back what others need to see has not built a skill for connection. He has built a sophisticated substitute for it. And the people on the receiving end of that technique, even when they can't name it, feel the absence of the real thing. They feel seen, but not known, heard, but not met. And eventually they stop coming back, not because you failed to execute the technique, but because the technique itself is a wall with the appearance of a window. The ambiguous moral lesson is where the philosophy reveals what it actually is beneath all the strategic language. They told you that pure moral clarity is a luxury, that real power lives in the gray areas, that focusing on outcomes over appearances is the mark of pragmatic sophistication. But watch what that framework actually does in practice. It gives you permission to cross lines by reframing every line as a situation requiring nuance. It makes your ethics flexible at precisely the moments when they need to be rigid. And the man who has trained himself to evaluate every moral question through the lens of strategic outcomes is not a sophisticated thinker. He is a man who has dismantled his own conscience and called the demolition wisdom. The gray area they told you to live in is not complexity, it is erosion. And it happens so gradually you don't notice until you are someone you would not have recognized 10 years ago. Here's the historical truth about this entire genre of content that repackages Machiavelli as a self-improvement framework. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in exile, stripped of his position, abandoned by the very political structures he had spent his career serving. He wrote it as an audition piece, trying to make himself useful to the Medici family that had just destroyed everything he built. The cold gospel of strategic detachment and calculated power was authored by a man who had been completely defeated by the system he was describing. That is not an origin story that gets mentioned when these lessons are sold to you. It should be the disclaimer on every single one. And here's what the controlled exposure lesson costs you that they never calculate into the equation. Yes, information revealed cannot be unrevealed. Yes, mystery creates curiosity. Yes, strategic disclosure can shape perception, all technically true. But the inverse is also true and far more important. Genuine intimacy cannot be built without genuine disclosure. Trust cannot deepen without vulnerability. The relationships that actually sustain you, the ones that show up when the room should be full and isn't, those relationships were built by people who said real things at real cost and let themselves be known. The man who practiced controlled exposure with everyone in his life didn't protect his narrative. He prevented his life from becoming one. Here's where the detachment principle does its deepest damage and why calling it freedom is one of the most effective lies in the manual.
Detachment from outcomes in negotiations, useful. Detachment from the need for approval, genuinely healthy. But the philosophy doesn't stay there. It expands. It tells you to be unafraid of losing relationships, unattached to love, unmoved by the people in your life. And what they call freedom looks from the outside like a man who cannot be manipulated. But what it feels like from the inside is a man who cannot be moved, who cannot be reached, who stands in the middle of his own life at a perfectly calculated distance from everything happening in it. That is not power. That is the description of a man who is already gone.
Psychologists have a name for the endpoint of the dark intelligence framework fully applied. They call it alexithymia, the inability to identify and process your own emotional states. It develops not from trauma alone, but from sustained, deliberate suppression of emotional response in favor of calculated reaction. The man who spent years training himself to calculate instead of feel, to assess instead of connect, to leverage instead of love, he doesn't just become strategically superior, he becomes emotionally illiterate. And emotional illiteracy is not a power, it is a disability that wears a very convincing costume. It looks like composure until the moment it needs to be something else and discovers it no longer can be. Here's the thing about the adaptive persona lesson that nobody says. The version of you that is most worth knowing, the one that has actual depth, actual history, actual contradiction and complexity and genuine feeling, that version cannot be adapted into. It can only be inhabited. And the man who spent a decade perfecting his ability to become whoever the room needed him to be did not develop a powerful skill. He developed a powerful avoidance of the work of actually becoming someone, of the discomfort of being known and rejected rather than performed and accepted. The most dangerous thing about the adaptive persona is not that it's fake, it's that it works well enough that you never have to find out if the real version would have worked better. The silent leverage lesson told you that real power whispers, that the quiet man who makes himself indispensable and waits for people to come to him is operating at a level the loud ones cannot reach. And here is what that philosophy produces at the end of a long enough timeline. A man who has been strategically quiet for so long that he has forgotten how to speak plainly, who has been positioning and waiting for so long that directness feels like weakness, who has optimized so completely for influence that he has lost the ability to simply be present with another person without calculating what the presence produces. And that man, the one who mastered silent leverage, is the loneliest expert in the room. So, if you've been studying these 8 lessons, if you've been practicing calculated opacity and detachment and controlled exposure and all the rest of it, if you've been building your strategic intelligence and watching yourself get better at the game, know this: the game has a cost that the scoreboard doesn't show. It costs you the version of yourself that people actually love. Not the version that impresses them, not the version that influences them, not the version that makes them feel strategically mirrored and psychologically echoed. The version they would actually miss. The version that is irreplaceable not because of what it produces, but because of what it is. And that version, the real, unoptimized, strategically useless, genuinely human version of you, is the only one that was ever going to build something worth having. The 8 lessons told you that dark intelligence is born from betrayal, humiliation, and defeat, that pain is the raw material and calculation is the product. And they were half right. Pain is a teacher, but what it teaches you is not how to become unreachable, it is how to become discerning. There is a version of intelligence that comes from everything those 8 lessons promised: the clarity, the strength, the inability to be easily manipulated, that does not require you to dismantle your humanity to access it. It requires you to deepen it. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one who feels nothing. It is the one who feels everything, understands everything, and still chooses to remain fully human in the middle of it. That is not a lesson Machiavelli wrote, because he never learned it. Don't make the same mistake.